It was the night Los Angeles went to war with the sky. Sirens wailed, searchlights tore through the darkness, and anti-aircraft guns thundered across the city as thousands of people watched in disbelief. Families hid in basements, soldiers fired round after round, and the city braced for an enemy attack that never came. Before we begin, drop in the comments where you're watching from, because this story reaches far beyond Los Angeles, touching on fear, confusion, and the fragile line between perception and reality in times of crisis. In the early hours of February 25, 1942, just weeks after Pearl Harbor, Los Angeles was already on edge. The shelling of Elwood near Santa Barbara had reminded Californians that the Pacific coast was vulnerable. Rumors swirled, nerves ran high, and when radar detected something moving offshore, the city braced for the worst. Then the guns opened fire, and what followed became one of the most debated nights in American wartime history. In the winter of 1941, the calm of the American Pacific coast had been shattered. News of the attack on Pearl Harbor traveled quickly across the country, and by the time Los Angeles awoke on December 8th, the city understood that war was no longer something distant. The devastation in Hawaii, with battleships sunk and thousands of lives lost, created an atmosphere of dread. If Japanese aircraft could strike so decisively there, what would stop them from crossing the Pacific and hitting the mainland? Los Angeles was more than just a cultural hub. By 1942, it had become an industrial heart of the American war effort, with aircraft factories in full swing at Burbank, Inglewood, and Santa Monica, churning out bombers and fighters for the growing conflict. The port bustled with military cargo, and oil fields dotted the coast. Every sign pointed to the city being a tempting target should Japan decide to carry the war onto American soil. Newspapers captured the mood. Speculation about carrier raids and coastal bombings filled their columns, and anxiety crept into everyday life. The unease was soon justified. In December, only 11 days after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese submarine I-17 surfaced off the California coast. Months later, on February 23, 1942, it returned to strike again. The submarine opened fire near the Elwood oil field, north of Santa Barbara. 16 shells were fired, damaging a pier and destroying a pump house, but little else. The physical damage was trivial. The psychological blow was enormous. For the first time in modern history, the continental United States had been shelled by a foreign enemy. Workers at the oil field fled in fear. Reports of explosions spread quickly, and Californians asked one another whether Los Angeles or San Diego might be next. The Army's Western Defense Command under General John L. DeWitt took no chances. Orders were given to tighten security, reinforce patrols, and place anti-aircraft crews on high alert. DeWitt himself warned publicly that the West Coast remained a probable target. The city responded with seriousness. Blackout drills became routine. Families pinned thick curtains over their windows. Neon signs that once lit Hollywood Boulevard went dark on command, and volunteers patrolled neighborhoods to ensure compliance. Car headlights were forbidden during alerts, and police issued citations to those who failed to obey. Yet not everyone complied. In a city as large and sprawling as Los Angeles, skepticism often battled with fear. Some saw the drills as needless. Others treated them as practice for what they felt was an inevitable attack. Behind the scenes, the military built a layered defense system. Radar installations had been hastily set up along the coast. Their operators trained on the same SCR-270 sets that had given a false alarm at Pearl Harbor. The technology was still crude, prone to interference and misinterpretation, but it offered the promise of early warning. Anti-aircraft batteries were placed in rings around Los Angeles, manned by the 37th Coast Artillery Brigade. Gun crews drilled daily with 37mm and 90mm weapons, waiting for a chance to prove themselves. High-powered searchlights stood ready to sweep the skies, intended to expose enemy bombers in the blackness of night. Despite the preparations, few in the city believed these defenses were foolproof. Fighters stationed at Marchfield and Muroc could, in theory, intercept incoming aircraft, but night flying remained limited and dangerous. Coordination between radar, searchlights, and artillery crews was inconsistent. The system was untested, and nerves were stretched thin. In February, the tension rose further. Reports of Japanese victories in Asia, most notably the fall of Singapore, filled American newspapers with grim news. The success of Japan's forces seemed unstoppable, and if Britain's strongest outpost in the Pacific could collapse, California did not feel immune. Each new air raid siren, each sudden order for blackout, carried with it a jolt of fear. Then came the night of February 23rd. The shells that struck Elwood convinced the public that an invasion was not only possible but imminent. In Los Angeles, rumors spread that Japanese aircraft carriers were lurking offshore, waiting to unleash waves of bombers. Military alerts grew more frequent, and civilians began to prepare themselves for the worst. By the evening of February 24th, the city of Los Angeles was wound tight with expectation. Anti-aircraft crews stood at their stations, radar screens were watched carefully, and searchlights waited to be switched on. Civil defense wardens were ready to enforce a blackout at a moment's notice. No one could say what would happen, but nearly everyone felt that something was coming. When the air raid sirens began that night, Los Angeles braced itself. The stage was set for one of the most confusing and controversial episodes of the war on American soil, the night that would later be remembered as the Battle of Los Angeles. Set on February 24, 1942, Los Angeles seemed to hold its breath. The memory of the submarine attack at Elwood the previous night lingered like a bruise, and warnings from the Western Defense Command had heightened the city's sense of unease. By evening, rumors of enemy aircraft moving toward the coast began to circulate among officials. Radar operators reported contacts over the Pacific, indistinct blips that could have been anything, planes, weather interference, or errors in the equipment. The uncertainty alone was enough to trigger alarms. At 7:18 p.m., an initial alert was issued, ordering defense units to prepare for possible action. For several tense hours, nothing materialized. Residents, hearing whispers of a potential raid, wondered whether the blackout curtains would have to be drawn again that night. The city remained restless, caught between fear and exhaustion, until just after midnight when radar operators once again detected what they believed might be incoming aircraft, approaching the coastline at high altitude. The reports moved swiftly through the chain of command, and at 2:21 a.m., the air raid sirens wailed across Los Angeles. The blackout was immediate. Streetlights went dark, neon signs flickered out, and cars halted along the roads as their headlights were extinguished. Families huddled in their homes behind drawn curtains, listening to the distant booms of artillery fire. Civil defense wardens walked the neighborhoods, making sure no light betrayed the city to whatever enemy might be overhead. Searchlights were activated, dozens of powerful beams slicing across the night sky. Their brilliant cones converged in patches of drifting cloud and smoke. Soldiers of the 37th Coast Artillery Brigade, stationed at gun batteries across the region, scanned the heavens nervously, waiting for confirmation. At 3:06 a.m., the first anti-aircraft guns opened fire. The city shook with the sound. In rapid succession, batteries along the coast and inland thundered into the night, sending fiery tracers arcing overhead. Shells burst in the darkness, leaving blossoms of smoke illuminated by the searchlights. Residents described the scene as both terrifying and surreal. Explosions reverberated through the basin, windows rattled, and children cried in their beds. Some swore they saw aircraft moving against the beams of light, dark shapes darting between the bursts of fire. Others reported nothing more than smoke and drifting clouds. For the next hour, Los Angeles was a city under siege. More than 1,400 shells were fired into the sky. Shrapnel rained down onto streets, rooftops, and cars. Buildings were scarred by falling fragments of metal, and fires broke out in scattered locations. The anti-aircraft crews, many firing their weapons for the first time in wartime conditions, continued their barrage with determination, even as no wreckage fell from the sky. At one point, military observers reported a large, slow-moving object illuminated in the beams of several converging searchlights. Guns concentrated on the target, unleashing a torrent of fire. Witnesses across the city later described seeing a glowing mass in the sky, though none could agree on its shape or nature. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing. The gunners, convinced they had struck a hostile aircraft, searched in vain for signs of debris. The barrage rolled on, echoing across the basin. Fighter aircraft were ordered to stand by, but in the confusion, none were launched. The risk of friendly fire in the blackout was considered too high. For civilians, the noise seemed endless. Many crouched in hallways or basements, waiting for the all-clear. In Long Beach, Santa Monica, and Inglewood, the spectacle lit the skies so brightly that it was visible for miles. At 4:14 a.m., the guns fell silent. The all-clear was not issued until 7:21 a.m., after commanders were satisfied that no enemy planes remained in the area. Daylight revealed a city scarred not by bombs but by its own defenses. Craters from anti-aircraft shells marked streets and yards. Shrapnel was collected by children as souvenirs. 5 civilians lost their lives that night, 3 killed by falling fragments, and 2 by heart attacks brought on by the stress of the bombardment. By the time Los Angeles returned to its uneasy calm, the questions had already begun. No wreckage had been recovered, no enemy aircraft confirmed. Yet thousands had seen the sky alight, had heard the roar of the guns, had felt the fear that comes only when one believes war has reached their doorstep. For the people of Los Angeles, it was a night that would not be forgotten, a night when the sky itself seemed to be at war. The thunder of guns that erupted over Los Angeles in the early hours of February 25, 1942, was unlike anything the city had ever experienced. Once the first batteries opened fire just after 3 o'clock, others quickly joined, and within minutes the basin echoed with a rolling barrage. From the coast at Santa Monica to inland positions near Inglewood, dozens of heavy guns poured fire into the night sky. The 37th Coast Artillery Brigade, manning most of the defenses around Los Angeles, had been drilled for such a moment since the days following Pearl Harbor. They were equipped with 37mm automatic weapons for low-level defense and heavier 90mm guns designed to target high-altitude bombers. The men at the batteries had trained endlessly, but almost none had yet fired in combat conditions. On this night, with radar reporting possible incoming aircraft and the searchlights probing the dark, the order to fire was carried out without hesitation. Tracers from the smaller guns streaked into the sky in red and orange arcs, their paths intersecting where gunners believed enemy craft to be. The heavier shells exploded high above the city, each burst a flash of fire followed by a lingering puff of smoke. When searchlights locked onto a patch of cloud or drifting smoke, the gunners often mistook it for a solid target. Witnesses later recalled the odd sight of beams converging on empty space, the guns hammering away, and the smoke blossoms multiplying. For nearly an hour, more than 1,400 shells were expended. The scale of firepower was immense, and the result was visible damage not to enemy aircraft but to the city itself. Shrapnel cascaded down into neighborhoods. Metal fragments punctured roofs and walls, shattered windows, and scarred automobiles. Fires broke out in scattered locations where hot fragments landed. Fire brigades rushed through darkened streets to put out small blazes, while civil defense volunteers struggled to keep frightened residents indoors. Among the military units, coordination problems were apparent. Radar reports were inconsistent, sometimes suggesting incoming aircraft, other times providing no clear picture at all. The relatively new technology was notoriously prone to false echoes, especially when weather conditions interfered. Clouds and smoke could generate signals that looked like aircraft formations. Searchlight crews often locked onto these echoes, sweeping their beams across the sky in vain attempts to catch an enemy plane. Artillery units, seeing the lights converge, assumed a target had been found and opened fire. In several locations, soldiers reported seeing large, slow-moving shapes silhouetted in the beams. Some believed they were attacking bombers flying at high altitude. Concentrated fire followed, filling the sky with explosions. Yet nothing fell from above, no wreckage, no burning planes. Commanders in the field faced the dilemma of choosing between standing down and risking the chance of an actual enemy strike. The decision was made to continue firing, erring on the side of caution. Civilians were caught in the crossfire of nerves and artillery. Many crouched in doorways or basements, listening to the relentless barrage. Some swore they could hear engines above, though official reports never confirmed such sounds. The psychological weight of the noise, the darkness, and the chaos magnified every impression. For many, it felt like the war had arrived at last. The human cost of the barrage became clear by morning. 5 civilians had died, 3 from falling fragments of shell and 2 from heart attacks during the tension of the blackout. Countless others were injured by shrapnel or accidents in the confusion. Property damage, while limited compared to a true bombing, was widespread. Streets and yards were littered with jagged steel. Children in the following days would collect the fragments as souvenirs, proof that the city had been fired upon, even if no enemy plane had been seen. From the perspective of the gun crews, the night was both a demonstration of readiness and a revelation of shortcomings. The barrage proved how quickly Los Angeles could respond, how disciplined the soldiers were in following orders under pressure. At the same time, it exposed the flaws in the system. The limits of radar, the difficulty of distinguishing real targets from illusions, and the dangers of unleashing thousands of pounds of ordnance over a populated city without confirmation of an enemy. By dawn, the smoke had drifted away, the guns were silent, and the city looked upon the scars of a night that had felt like a battle but left behind no wreckage of a foe. For the army and for the residents of Los Angeles, the question lingered, what exactly had been fired upon? When the guns opened fire over Los Angeles in the early hours of February 25, 1942, the city's millions of residents became unwilling witnesses to the chaos. The blackout plunged entire neighborhoods into darkness, leaving only the glow of searchlights and the bursts of artillery fire to mark the night. For those on the ground, the experience was bewildering, frightening, and unforgettable. In homes across the basin, families were jolted awake by the wail of air raid sirens just after 2 in the morning. Some rushed to cover windows with blankets. Others crowded into hallways or basements as the first explosions thundered above. The Los Angeles Times later described how the roar of the barrage rattled buildings and caused dishes and glass to fall from shelves. For children, the noise and confusion turned quickly into panic. Parents tried to calm them, but the constant thunder made it impossible to believe that safety lay anywhere nearby. Eyewitnesses gave accounts that varied wildly. Some swore they saw aircraft flying in formation, darting through the beams of converging searchlights. Others insisted they could make out a large object, illuminated as shells burst around it, moving slowly over the city. A few said they heard the hum of engines. Many more admitted they saw nothing at all, only smoke, flashes, and the drifting clouds of exploding ordnance. The contradictions reflected the difficulty of making sense of events in the middle of a blackout, under stress, with the sky alive with fire. Reporters who ventured out during the night gathered stories from people in different neighborhoods. In Inglewood, residents stood outside their houses, watching the sky with a mixture of awe and fear. In Long Beach, shrapnel fell onto rooftops, leaving holes in tiles and shingles. In Hollywood, where the searchlights cut across the hills, some residents described the spectacle as a bizarre fireworks show, though the sound of the guns and the danger of falling fragments stripped the moment of any joy. By morning, the stories multiplied. The Herald-Examiner carried reports of families forced to flee their homes after fragments smashed through walls or set small fires. One man told of crouching with his children in the hallway as pieces of hot metal clattered onto the roof. Another recalled rushing to put out a blaze in his garage after shrapnel pierced it. Many described the shock of finding yards and streets littered with twisted steel when daylight came. Children quickly began collecting the fragments, carrying them to school and showing them off as trophies of a night that felt like war. Casualties added a grim dimension to the accounts. 3 people were confirmed killed by falling debris, their homes struck by fragments from the guns above. 2 more died of heart attacks during the tension of the alert, their families later describing the fear that overtook them as the sirens wailed and the sky erupted. Hospitals reported treating dozens for cuts, burns, and shock. The press reflected the confusion of the moment. Photographs printed in the Los Angeles Times the next day showed searchlights converging on a patch of sky, shells bursting around it in bright flashes. To many readers, the image looked like proof of enemy aircraft. The caption beneath spoke of unidentified objects over the city. At the same time, editorials raised questions. If so many guns had fired for so long, where was the wreckage? Why had no enemy planes been recovered? Despite the lack of evidence, civilians held fast to what they had seen. Letters to the editor poured into local papers, some insisting they had watched planes cross the basin, others just as adamant that the military had fired at nothing more than nerves and clouds. One woman wrote that she had stood with her neighbors, counting what they believed were more than a dozen aircraft. Another man described watching the beams of light converge on a massive object, larger than any plane he had ever seen, drifting silently until the smoke swallowed it. For every account of enemy craft, there were others that spoke only of fear and chaos. A store clerk recalled hiding beneath a counter as glass shattered from nearby explosions. A farmer on the outskirts of the city described how his livestock panicked at the sound, some breaking through fences. For countless families, the night was less about what they saw and more about what they felt. The sense that their city had become a battlefield. When the all-clear finally sounded at dawn, the relief was palpable. Residents emerged into the streets to see the damage. The sight of shell fragments scattered across lawns and sidewalks became the dominant memory of the morning. They were tangible evidence that something had happened, even if no one could agree on what. The stories, often conflicting, spread quickly and became part of the city's collective memory. That morning, as the newspapers hit the stands, Los Angeles was left to puzzle over the contradictions. Some clung to the belief that enemy planes had been driven off. Others suspected the barrage had been a mistake. Nerves stretched too thin in the shadow of Pearl Harbor and Elwood. For ordinary Angelenos, however, the official explanations mattered less than the memory of a sleepless night, the thunder of the guns, and the fear that the war had come to their very doorsteps. When daylight broke over Los Angeles on February 25, 1942, the gun crews stood down and the city tried to make sense of the chaos. The barrage had left streets littered with fragments, buildings scarred, and families shaken. But there was one glaring absence. No wreckage, no bodies, no sign of an enemy. The silence of the sky stood in stark contrast to the fury of the night before. Almost immediately, confusion set in, not only among civilians but within the ranks of the military itself. The army, which had manned the anti-aircraft batteries, was the first to speak. Its commanders in the Western Defense Command issued statements suggesting that unidentified aircraft had been detected over the city. General John L. DeWitt, responsible for West Coast defense, initially reported that between 1 and 5 unidentified planes had flown over Los Angeles, possibly as part of a raid or reconnaissance mission. His tone was cautious but defensive. The barrage, he implied, had been justified. If the guns had fired at nothing, then the responsibility for the deaths and damage would be harder to explain. The Navy, however, quickly contradicted the Army's narrative. Navy Secretary Frank Knox, speaking at a press conference in Washington on February 25th, told reporters that the incident was nothing more than a false alarm. Knox dismissed the idea of enemy aircraft entirely, attributing the chaos to nerves and jittery defenses in the wake of the submarine shelling at Elwood. To him, Los Angeles had simply panicked. The disagreement between the Army and Navy played out in newspapers across the country. On the West Coast, readers woke to see bold headlines, "Air battle rages over Los Angeles," splashed across the Los Angeles Times, accompanied by dramatic photographs of searchlights converging on the night sky. The imagery gave weight to the idea that enemy aircraft had been present. Yet in Washington, Knox's statement painted a different picture, and newspapers on the East Coast ran with headlines about hysteria and misidentification. The lack of clarity left the public frustrated. Residents who had watched the sky insisted they had seen planes. Gun crews swore they had fired at targets. Meanwhile, government officials struggled to maintain a unified message. President Roosevelt, who received reports of the incident, chose not to address it directly, leaving the contradictions unresolved. Behind closed doors, the Army and Navy each sought to defend their positions. Army officers argued that radar operators had tracked objects approaching the coast, and that visual sightings from searchlight crews had corroborated the reports. They pointed to the discipline of their gunners and insisted that so much ammunition would not have been expended without cause. The Navy countered that its coastal patrols and intelligence reports showed no enemy aircraft in the area. Japanese forces, they said, had not launched any attack that night. The official reports that followed only deepened the ambiguity. In the days immediately after, the Army suggested the possibility of a few enemy planes, perhaps reconnaissance craft, slipping in to test defenses. Others within the command speculated that commercial aircraft might have been mistaken for enemy planes, though no civilian flights had been scheduled over the city during the blackout. The Navy stuck firmly to its assessment of a false alarm. The press seized on the contradictions. Editorials questioned how two branches of the military could produce such different explanations for the same event. Some newspapers openly criticized the government for its lack of transparency, warning that public trust would erode if the truth was not provided. Others urged readers to remember Pearl Harbor and to accept that heightened nerves were unavoidable. For the people of Los Angeles, the conflicting stories provided little comfort. To those who had seen the searchlights converge on what appeared to be solid shapes, the Navy's dismissal rang hollow. To others, Knox's version made sense. The night had been chaotic, the sky filled with smoke, and panic was an understandable reaction. Yet no explanation accounted for everything. Not the radar contacts, not the eyewitnesses, not the sheer scale of the barrage. The debate did not fade quickly. In the following weeks, letters poured into newspapers from readers demanding clarity. Was Los Angeles really attacked, or had its defenders wasted thousands of shells on clouds and nerves? The government offered no definitive answer, and so the incident remained suspended between competing narratives. By the end of February, the official record stood divided. The Army leaning toward the idea of enemy aircraft, the Navy insisting on false alarm. Both sides presented their conclusions with confidence, yet neither could produce evidence. The lack of wreckage and the absence of confirmed enemy losses meant the question remained open. For the public, this ambiguity gave the night a strange power. It had been real, terrifying, and deadly, yet it left no clear story behind. Only fragments of steel, conflicting words from officials, and the memory of fear. The morning after the guns fell silent, Los Angeles woke to a city buzzing with rumor and speculation. Shrapnel still lay scattered across lawns and streets, the evidence of a night that had shaken millions. Newspapers rushed to capture the mood, and by dawn, the story was already in print. The Los Angeles Times ran a headline that roared from its front page, "Air battle rages over Los Angeles." Accompanying the words was an image that would become iconic. The beams of searchlights crisscrossing the sky, converging on a bright cloud of smoke and bursts of artillery fire. To many readers, it looked like undeniable proof that the city had been under attack. The photograph, taken with long exposure, exaggerated the spectacle, giving the impression of a massive target caught in the lights. Other papers took different tones. The Los Angeles Examiner described the night as hours of chaos, while the San Francisco Chronicle relayed Navy Secretary Frank Knox's statement that the incident had been a false alarm, the result of jitters and nerves. The New York Times, far from the action, published Knox's version prominently, casting the West Coast's ordeal as hysteria. The press reflected the divisions in official accounts, and so the public, reading the headlines, found themselves caught between two competing versions of the truth. On one side, the photographs and eyewitness stories gave weight to the belief that enemy planes had flown overhead. On the other, the Navy's dismissal suggested that Los Angeles had panicked in the dark, firing thousands of shells at nothing. For the people who had lived through it, the reporting struck deep nerves. Letters poured into newsrooms. Some residents insisted they had counted multiple aircraft moving against the glow of the searchlights. Others demanded to know why, if enemy planes had been present, no wreckage had been recovered. A few mocked the event as an embarrassing overreaction, evidence that the city was unprepared for war. Public reaction ranged from anger to ridicule to lingering fear. In downtown cafes, the night's events became the only topic of conversation. In factories and offices, workers traded stories of what they had seen or heard. Parents described children crying through the night, terrified that bombs would fall on their homes. Business owners tallied the costs of broken windows and minor fires. The deaths of 5 civilians, reported widely in the papers, cast a grim shadow over the debate, a reminder that whatever the truth, the night had left real scars. The newspapers fanned the flames. The Times, standing by its dramatic coverage, highlighted eyewitness testimony that seemed to confirm an air raid. The Herald Examiner gave voice to skeptics, suggesting that the city had been misled by its own defenses. Across the nation, editorial writers seized on the story. Some accused the army of wasting resources and risking lives. Others argued that caution was necessary, that the memory of Pearl Harbor demanded vigilance, even at the risk of embarrassment. In the days that followed, the photograph of the Searchlights took on a life of its own. Reprinted in newspapers across the country, it gave the impression of a massive aerial battle, even as officials continued to contradict one another. For many Americans, the image became the enduring symbol of the event. A city's defenses blazing against an unseen enemy. Public trust in the military's explanations began to fray. On the West Coast, many civilians questioned why the Army and Navy could not agree on what had happened. Some suspected a cover-up, believing that the government was concealing evidence of enemy activity to prevent panic. Others saw the whole affair as proof that America's defenses were still uncoordinated and vulnerable. Yet, for all the criticism, the incident also deepened resolve. Factories continued their work, producing aircraft and weapons at a frantic pace. Civil defense drills gained new urgency, as Angelenos felt that if the skies had not delivered bombs this time, they surely would in the future. The blackout curtains stayed in place, the sirens remained ready, and the people waited for the next alarm. The press had turned a night of confusion into a story of national attention, but it left more questions than answers. Whether Los Angeles had faced enemy planes or had fired upon shadows remained unsettled. What was certain was that the event had seared itself into the city's memory, carried forward not only in official reports but in headlines, photographs, and the voices of those who lived through it. In the weeks after the Searchlights swept the Los Angeles sky, official Washington sought to bring closure to the confusion, but the explanations never aligned. The Army maintained that unidentified aircraft had triggered the barrage, while the Navy insisted the entire affair was a false alarm. In the background, President Roosevelt avoided comment, leaving the matter to linger as both a mystery and an embarrassment. Congress took notice. In February 1942, a House committee on the War Effort pressed Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox to explain his statement of a false alarm. Knox repeated his view. No enemy planes had been over Los Angeles, and the gunfire had been caused by nervous gunners. Members of the committee questioned whether the Army and Navy were communicating effectively, since their accounts directly contradicted one another. The testimony offered no resolution, only a clearer view of the bureaucratic divide. The War Department received after-action reports from General John L. DeWitt's Western Defense Command. DeWitt's men noted that radar had picked up a possible approach of unidentified craft over the Pacific, and that visual observers claimed to have seen between 1 and 15 planes in the night sky. But even DeWitt's own report admitted no bombs had been dropped, no aircraft had been shot down, and no wreckage recovered. His cautious conclusion was that probably 15 airplanes had been over Los Angeles, possibly as a reconnaissance mission. Japanese records reviewed after the war would contradict this. Tokyo's military archives revealed no raid, no reconnaissance flight, and no planned incursion over California on that date. Japan had launched submarine attacks, such as the shelling of Elwood 2 days earlier, but no aircraft missions reached Los Angeles. This absence of Japanese activity cast doubt on the Army's claims, though the records would not be available to the American public until years later. For civilians, the confusion remained unresolved in real time. The Los Angeles Times and other West Coast papers continued to field letters from citizens demanding explanations. Rumors of cover-ups persisted, fueled by the gap between what residents believed they had seen and what officials declared. Some speculated that the government was hiding evidence of Japanese planes to prevent panic. Others suggested secret American experimental aircraft had triggered the alert. None of these theories were supported by official documents, but the lack of clarity gave them life. By 1943, attention had shifted to other wartime concerns, and the incident gradually faded from the headlines. Factories expanded, blackouts became routine, and the memory of that night settled into folklore more than policy. The deaths of the 5 civilians were acknowledged but rarely revisited in official accounts, written off as tragic collateral of wartime nerves. It was not until 7 years later that the military formally revisited the incident. In 1949, the newly established U.S. Air Force, inheriting responsibility for America's skies, published an analysis of what had occurred. Their conclusion was unambiguous. No enemy aircraft had been over Los Angeles on the night of February 24th to 25th, 1942. The barrage, they stated, had been triggered by a combination of heightened nerves, radar misinterpretations, and the drifting presence of weather balloons. The Air Force Review dismissed earlier claims of enemy planes, pointing to Japanese records that showed no flights in the region and the absence of any physical evidence. They argued that once the anti-aircraft guns began firing, smoke, shell bursts, and converging searchlights created the illusion of moving aircraft. Eyewitnesses, already on edge after Pearl Harbor, interpreted those illusions as real planes. The report classified the Battle of Los Angeles as an incident of war nerves, magnified by inexperience and poor communication. For the public, the 1949 conclusion closed the case officially but not emotionally. Many Angelenos who had lived through the barrage refused to believe they had seen only smoke and light. The famous photograph, reprinted countless times, continued to suggest something tangible had been caught in the beams. The gap between official explanation and lived experience left room for doubt, and doubt ensured the story's survival. By the end of the decade, the incident had shifted from a matter of national security to a curiosity of wartime memory. The Army and Navy had moved on, their contradictions recorded but unresolved. The Air Force had rendered its judgment, calling the event an illusion. But in Los Angeles, the story lived on in recollections of searchlights, thunderous barrages, and a night when the city believed it was under attack. In the years after the war, Los Angeles transformed. Factories that had built bombers and ships shifted to peacetime industries, and the sprawling suburbs of Southern California grew. But the night of February 24th to 25th, 1942 lingered as one of the strangest wartime memories the city carried. Veterans who had manned the guns spoke of it in recollections published decades later, insisting they had seen aircraft darting across the beams. Others recalled the terror of huddling in darkened homes, listening to the thunder of explosions and wondering if the next shell might fall nearby. By the 1950s, as America entered the Cold War, the incident resurfaced in discussions of readiness and vulnerability. Historians of the war, reviewing reports and Japanese records, often cited the Battle of Los Angeles as a case study in mass hysteria during wartime. The 1949 Air Force report was frequently quoted as evidence that the event had been nothing more than an error, but that explanation never satisfied everyone. The famous photograph, reprinted in books and magazines, always seemed to suggest a target where none officially existed. In the 1960s and 1970s, the story became entangled in the growing cultural appetite for questioning government narratives. Writers examining Pearl Harbor, secret weapons programs, and Cold War secrecy often revisited the events over Los Angeles as an example of official contradiction. Oral histories collected during those decades reflected a divide between trust in the Air Force's conclusion and the insistence of witnesses that something tangible had flown overhead. By the 1980s, the incident was increasingly absorbed into popular culture. Documentaries on wartime America included segments on the barrage, often showing the grainy black and white photograph of searchlights converging in the sky. Local Los Angeles newspapers, marking anniversaries, ran retrospectives that gathered both military documents and human recollections, framing the night as one of the city's most enduring mysteries. The legacy also survived in the physical city. Veterans' halls displayed fragments of shrapnel collected from the streets. Families passed down stories of that night, retold at dinner tables or family gatherings. For younger generations who had not lived through the war, the tale grew into legend. A night when the city fired into the darkness, unsure of what threatened it. When the declassification of military records in later decades provided fuller access to Japanese wartime archives, the absence of any enemy mission over Los Angeles became indisputable. Scholars pointed out that the Japanese military had neither the range nor the operational orders to fly aircraft over Southern California in early 1942. Still, the certainty of official records did little to erase the unease of those who remembered otherwise. The story never disappeared from public conversation. Each February, local journalists would revisit it, interviewing survivors or their descendants. The contradictions between the Army, Navy, and Air Force accounts gave the narrative a permanence. It was not only a story of wartime panic, but also of bureaucracy and miscommunication under pressure. By the late 20th century, the phrase Battle of Los Angeles had entered the broader cultural lexicon. Books on wartime America routinely included it. Radio specials and history programs recounted the chaos of that night. In classrooms, teachers used it to illustrate the fear that gripped the West Coast after Pearl Harbor. The photograph, with its eerie geometry of light and smoke, remained the centerpiece, printed again and again as the visual memory of an event that still refused to be fully explained to public satisfaction. In the 21st century, the event continues to occupy a curious space between history and memory. Historians treat it as a vivid example of wartime nerves compounded by poor communication between military branches. Journalists highlight it as one of the most unusual homefront episodes of World War II. For Angelenos, it survives as part of the city's lore, a reminder of the night when the horizon seemed to glow with enemy fire, even though none had come. The legacy is layered. The loss of civilian life, the spectacle of searchlights and anti-aircraft fire, the contradiction of official statements, and the endurance of memory across generations. What began as an eruption of gunfire over a frightened city has endured as a story retold for over 80 years, part cautionary tale, part unresolved puzzle, and above all, a reflection of how uncertainty can etch itself into history more deeply than certainty ever could. The barrage that rattled Los Angeles in the early hours of February 25, 1942, began as a burst of panic in the shadow of Pearl Harbor and the shelling of Elwood. In the dark sky, searchlights clawed upward, converging on shapes that observers swore they saw. Anti-aircraft guns roared, shells exploded, and the city shook under a storm of its own making. The noise, the smoke, and the spectacle created the sensation of an invasion. For hours, the defenders fired, and for hours, the city believed itself under attack. When dawn came, no wreckage lay on the ground, no bombs had fallen, and no enemy had appeared. Yet the damage was real. 5 civilians were dead, buildings bore scars from shell fragments, and a population was left unsettled. The authorities scrambled to explain, but explanations never aligned. The Army insisted planes had been overhead, perhaps a small squadron sent to test defenses. The Navy dismissed the affair as nerves and false alarms. Newspapers amplified the contradictions, and the famous photograph of searchlights converging in the sky ensured that confusion would never fade completely. For the men and women who lived through it, the memory was vivid. Families told of hiding in basements, listening to walls rattle from nearby bursts. Gunners spoke of swearing they saw aircraft darting between beams, impossible to track but undeniable in their minds. Children remembered the shriek of sirens and the flashes lighting the horizon. Even as official reports minimized the event, human testimony preserved a different picture. One of conviction that something had been there, even if no proof was ever found. Investigations stretched on. General DeWitt's report insisted a small number of planes had been present. Congressional committees revealed the split between Army and Navy accounts, exposing the weaknesses of wartime communication. Years later, Japanese military records revealed that no planes had flown over Los Angeles that night, leaving only the possibility of weather balloons and illusions magnified by the chaos of gunfire and light. In 1949, the Air Force declared the case settled. The Battle of Los Angeles had been a false alarm, yet the official conclusion did not erase memory. The incident had already entered the fabric of Los Angeles lore. In the post-war years, it was recalled in veterans' halls, retold at dinner tables, and invoked in newspaper retrospectives. Each retelling carried its own emphasis. The terror of waiting in the dark, the embarrassment of wasted ammunition, the tragedy of civilian deaths, or the strangeness of a night when the city fired into emptiness. As the decades passed, the story gained new layers. During the Cold War, it was used as an example of how quickly fear could escalate into overreaction. In the 1960s and 1970s, amid growing distrust of government, the contradictions between official statements became fuel for skepticism. By the 1980s and beyond, the story was no longer just history but part of popular culture, recalled in documentaries, history programs, and countless anniversary articles. The photograph, stark and grainy, ensured the night remained unforgettable. Published again and again, it suggested a form suspended in light, even though the Air Force dismissed it as smoke and glare. For many, the image carried more weight than any official document. It gave shape to the belief that something had been there, even if no evidence was ever found. In classrooms, the Battle of Los Angeles became a lesson on wartime hysteria and the fog of conflict. In Los Angeles itself, it remained a part of local identity, remembered alongside blackouts, rationing, and the city's rapid wartime transformation. For families who lost loved ones that night, not to enemy bombs but to accidents and heart attacks brought on by fear, the incident stood as a quiet tragedy, overshadowed by larger battles but no less real. 80 years later, the night still resists neat conclusion. To historians, it is a clear case of nerves, miscommunication, and illusion, compounded by the inexperience of defenses newly mobilized after Pearl Harbor. To those who lived it, it was the night the war came home, if only in the imagination. And to the city of Los Angeles, it remains an enduring story, told not because of what was found, but because of what was never found. The Battle of Los Angeles endures because it lies at the intersection of fact and perception. The facts are settled. No planes, no bombs, no enemy. The perception, however, remains unsettled. Lights in the sky, shadows against search beams, the thunder of fire against a target that never revealed itself. It is this tension between what history records and what memory insists that has carried the story forward for generations. In the end, the legacy of that night is not about a battle fought or an enemy repelled. It is about uncertainty, fear, and the human need to make sense of what unfolds in moments of crisis. The searchlights have long since dimmed, the guns have fallen silent, but the echoes of that night in 1942 remain woven into the memory of a city and a nation that once believed the war had arrived on its doorstep. The guns fell silent long ago, but the echoes of that night in 1942 have never fully faded. What began as fear of an attack became a symbol of confusion, panic, and the strange ways memory outlives fact. No enemy ever appeared, no wreckage was ever found, yet the Battle of Los Angeles remains etched into history as the night a city fired at shadows. And now, after all these years, the story still asks a question that only you can answer. Was it fear? Was it illusion? Or was it something more? If you've stayed with me until the end, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think really happened over Los Angeles that night? Share your perspective in the comments. I read every one. This is Eternal Obsidian, where history's shadows are brought into the light. If you found this story powerful, don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more untold history, and ring the bell so you never miss what comes next.